My name is Elleni Centime Zeleke. I'm an assistant professor of African Studies in the Department of Middle East, South Asian, and African Studies. So broadly speaking, my interests are in the region of the Horn of Africa. I'm particularly interested in student movements in the Horn of Africa. I wrote a book called Ethiopia in Theory, which looks at the student movement from the 1960s and 1970s in Ethiopia and the impact that that student movement had on the 1974 revolution in Ethiopia and the consequences of their ideas in terms of shaping political processes and policies in Ethiopia in the post-revolutionary period right up until 2016. More broadly speaking, I would say I'm interested in African political theory, African political thought, questions of freedom, and questions of sort of war and conflict and how that intersects with larger questions to do with social change and social movements. So I think what makes MESAAS unique is that it looks at regional questions that might have to do with, the Horn of Africa or Africa in a comparative perspective. So we're never just asking questions about Ethiopia as a singular geographical entity, but looking at questions that come out of the Ethiopian context in relationship to other questions that are happening in Africa, but also in the Middle East and South Asia. I also think that at MESAAS, we tend to think about area studies from a more theoretical perspective. So we're not just doing African studies simply in terms of thinking about Africa as a geographical entity, but thinking about Africa as a theoretical concept as well. So what does it mean to be African? Where does the concept of Africa come from? And we try to think about that, again, in relationship to other regional questions and other geographies as well. So I think the reason why one would come to MESAAS is that we have top-notch thinkers from the global south who are in conversation with each other across regions. So I think that a lot of the questions that we ask, would be asked in other departments, but again, from a very singular territorial perspective. So somebody might be in an African Studies department, but they would think about those questions only in relationship to Africa. And I think the comparative perspective at MESAAS really helps to develop a much more global perspective on the types of questions that you're asking, and just puts you in conversation with a really diverse group of both faculty and students.